when I first heard about Sinan's work, was working with a small company, and one of their lead developers came up with a rather interesting question. And he said he was looking at data from Facebook and trying to figure out how people influence each other. And so he had a very specific question, which is, I've just analyzed a bunch of data, and I see that some of the people have taken an action. Let's say they've clicked on a link. And what I'm trying to figure out is, did they click on the link because they are just like some other people, like they have the same demographics, they are similar to their friends, or are they, in fact, being influenced by their friends? And so this was sort of the first time that I'd heard about this concept of influence and trying to separate it out from, just demographics. Are you behaving the same way because you're just similar, versus are you behaving a certain way because someone's influencing you? And I thought that was fascinating. And then it turns out that Sinan has actually figured this all out. So that's why he's here, and he's going to tell us how it works.
Hey, guys. So, no, I'm good. Can everyone hear me okay? Excellent. So I know it's been a long day with lots of amazing, creative ideas. So I'm going to try and keep you awake, and I'm going to start with 3 sort of confessions in full disclosure. Okay, so the first one is that I am a complete nerd. You will see all sorts of rapid-fire science coming over my slides. Don't think you have to remember it all or anything like that. If you have any questions, come talk to me afterwards. I will certainly geek out at moments during this talk, and that's okay. I'm okay with that. Okay. The second one is that I've heard people describe my talks as like drinking from a fire hose. So if you feel a little sort of like overwhelmed, that's okay too. Again, it'll be sort of rapid fire during the whole process. And the third really haven't even been announced yet, but they'll be after this session. Drink, but that's when interest in anything, I'll be there until it closes. So please come have a conversation. Tell me what you think. So, the conference is about reworking, so I want to talk a little about re-networking, and specifically about social networks. And I firmly believe 2 things. First, human society is changing dramatically and has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. The way we interact with one another, the way we communicate with one another, the degree to which we're connected to one another, the degree to which is instantiated is dramatically changing. The second thing I believe is that we're on the brink of a revolution in our understanding of human behavior, and this is because we have so much data at the microsecond timestamp level about how we drive, how we buy, how we communicate, how we authenticate, how we rate. And we have this for a couple of thousand people, but we have it for 800 million people at the same time. So using this data, I believe that we can do everything from promote HIV testing, promote the adoption of our products, or many other things, some of which I'll talk about. So a preface to start this whole thing off. The first is that social networks are driving all sorts of new changes in society. For instance, social commerce. This is a Wired UK news cover, which is how your networks are driving what you buy, right? Social commerce. If I like something, does it change what my friends purchase online? It's not just about social commerce. Lots of companies are interested in that. They want to measure your influence online. They want to understand how much a like is worth to somebody online, etc. It's not just about commerce. It's also inside the organization, right? LinkedIn, but also other types of companies are trying to understand knowledge management through social networks inside the organization, expertise matching, expertise finding, community building, discussion, and how does that relate to productivity? Really earlier about, well, what is the link to productivity in all of this? I'll discuss exactly that in the second half of the talk. And it's not just about commerce, it's also about social mobilization. It's about revolution. So people are wondering, is Facebook a catalyst for revolution in the Arab Spring? Is it just a necessary component? Would there be revolution? Wouldn't there be revolution because of all this connectivity? And this is about mobilizing your friends and protest, not about mobilizing to buy something. So what I think is that if we can understand how and influence spreads in a social network and thus in a population from person to person to person to person, we can potentially promote behaviors like productivity, product demand, but also condom use, fiscal responsibility, economic development. Potentially contain behaviors like these: smoking, dirty needle sharing, fraud. I'm working on a that uses these methods. I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So I'm social network data to understand how individuals influence one another to do everything from buy a new product, vote for a different political candidate, or take a different health behavior like take an HIV. And the most important part of my research is causal inference, causal statistical estimation. So I have this cartoon on my door in my office. It's two friends talking, and one says to the other, I used to think correlation implied causation, physics class, and now I don't. And the friend says, it sounds like the class helped. And the guy goes, well, maybe. And the idea, yeah, maybe the class is teaching me about statistics, or maybe I have a proclivity to understand statistics because I have an interest in statistics, so I select into the class, and if I from the population, it would be higher. Select into the class. This is the difference between correlation. In network science, this is known as the reflection problem, okay? So we have abundant empirical evidence today that human behaviors tend to cluster in network space and in time. So people who are friends tend to do things the same and tend to do those same things at approximately. But is this because of peer influence or alternative explanations? And let me give you an example. So Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler wrote this really great study in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2007 about obesity being contagious. Raise your hand if you've heard of this study. Okay, lots of people have heard of this study. It even made front page headlines, and the conclusions that were picked up and drawn in the media. By the way, what the study showed was that body mass index increases are correlated over time amongst friends. Pretty simple result. The news media, you got front page New York Times articles like this one, are your friends fat? Okay? Very causal statement. Your friends are making you fat. But there are a lot of alternative explanations for this same result that they found in the scientific peer-reviewed article. Homophily, okay? All homophily means is birds of a feather flock together. We tend to make friends with so what this means is that it could be that if I make friends with somebody become obese, that I have a greater likelihood of becoming obese because we have similar preferences. Maybe you have people who like the all-you-can-eat buffet line at Denny's that tend to be friends, and people who like marathon running that tend to be friends, and their weight gain is correlated because of their natural proclivities, which make them friends, rather than influence transmitting obesity from one person to another. And homophily isn't a new concept. It was Aristotle who said people love those who are like themselves, and before Aristotle, it was Plato who said similarity begets friendship. And just to prove to you that a long line of worthy scholars have made this argument, Mom who said hanging out with a bad crowd will get you into trouble, okay? She wasn't too happy when I told her that she might have gotten the causal structure. So Slate ran an article called Everything is Contagious, ironically about the contagion amongst academics to publish studies about contagion. So it wasn't just obesity. Apparently happiness is contagious, and product adoption is contagious, and cooperation is contagious, and my favorite one, loneliness, which I'm still trying to figure out. And there are a lot of alternative explanations that could account for this. Homophily there are confounding effects as well. Let's say you make friends with people in your local neighborhood and a new restaurant opens up. That might affect your obesity. Or let's say you make friends with people at work and your work creates a program where you get benefits if you go to the health gym or something like that. That might create correlations in obesity amongst friends. Okay? There are two reasons why separating correlation from First is that the causal structure of the underlying dynamic process of the spread of a behavior through the network implies different diffusion properties for the behavior. Where is it going? Who should we target? But second, it also implies different optimal containment and promotion policies. If influence is really going on, then you might want to take a peer-to-peer strategy to promote or contain the behavior in the network. But if it's just demographic similarity, or preference similarity, which happens to be correlated with the connections in the network, then you just want to segment the population based on observable preference characteristics and target those people with messages. It's a completely different strategy if influence is at play and if it isn't. Okay? So let's talk about this in the context of external to the engaging with consumers. We did a study with Yahoo where we studied 30 million people connected in an instant messenger graph and the adoption of a new product they launched called Yahoo Go. And what Yahoo wanted to know was, well, to what extent is peer influence spreading this product? So we took this data, 30 million people interacting on instant messenger, sending each other messages. This gave us our social network, and then we saw every single person that adopted that product throughout the network. And they said to us, come up with a statistical plan to separate correlation from causation in this network. And we said, wow, that's a tough challenge. So we went and we created methodology. We published it in a peer-reviewed journal, and here's what we found. Okay? If you just looked at a simple logistic regression that says your likelihood of adopting the product as a function of the number of friends you have who have adopted the product, here's what. So here's the days since launch, and this is your probability of adoption conditional that you have friends who adopt it. Okay? In the beginning of the life cycle of the product, in the first 2 to 3 weeks, you are 16 times more likely to adopt the product if your friends adopted the product. Okay? And then that seems, so you look at this and you say, wow, there's a social influence at the beginning of the life cycle of the product, and then it sort of tapers off, and 160 days since the product launch, influence is very low. Okay? Then we applied our statistical methodology that separates homophily, confounding factors, etc., from pure influence, and this is what we found. Okay? So controlling for correlated preferences and confounding effects, it looks like influence is not as big as you would expect. Right? That a lot of this co-adoption of the product is because of similar preferences rather than because of influence. In addition, this idea that it's high at the beginning and low at the end goes away. A marketing executive looking at the graph in black would say, we need a peer-to-peer strategy at the beginning of the life cycle of the product and a market segmentation strategy at the end of the life cycle of the product. But somebody who knows the real data that influence is constant over time says that's not the case. So the question arose to us, why is it that you see this huge difference? Why does influence look so exaggerated at the beginning, right when a product is launched? So we looked at the preference similarities between people and their adopter and non-adopter friends throughout the life cycle of the product. And what this graph shows you is the similarity being high at the top and low at the bottom, between adopters of the product and their adopter friends in these white circles, their non-adopter friends in these black squares, and a random user who wasn't connected to them in these diamonds. So what you find is that people who adopt early are much more like their other adopter friends than their non-adopter friends. But 6 months out or 5 months out, those two groups are indistinguishable. People who adopt the product, late adopters of the product, are as much like their adopter friends as their non-adopter friends. What does this mean? It means that people who are sitting in line waiting for the next iPhone or the next iPad are different. And they're more like each other than they are like their other friends. And they're different in their preference similarities. And that's why this graph, looks so different at the beginning when you don't control for influence, okay? We then did an experiment on Facebook amongst 12 million people. Understand was, forget viral marketing, taking a product that exists and putting a viral marketing plan on top of that product. Can we engineer the product from the beginning to go viral? So we called this viral product design. How can we engineer products so they're more likely to go viral? So what we did in this experiment, and the reason we did an experiment is because observational methods of and correlation from causation are fraught with difficulties. It's very difficult. That's why randomized experimentation is the gold standard of causal inference. That's why in clinical trials you require randomized experiments. Okay, so we did an experiment. We set up a movie application, a commercial grade movie application, and as people adopted it, we divided them into control and experimental groups. And what we did is we randomly enabled different viral messaging features for the experimental group, but not for the control group. And then we observed the adoption and use of the application by friends of the control and experimental group users. We looked at two features. One is personal invitations. So you can imagine that as I gave you the opportunity to personally invite your friends to reworking next year. And then the second is a passive awareness campaign. Say I gave you all t-shirts that said you went to reworking. Every time you saw your friends, it was sort of a passive advertisement that you had been to the conference. As you can imagine, the personal invitation was more persuasive per message. Per message. And it nearly doubled the global diffusion of the product in the network, but it was the passive awareness campaign that had a much larger effect on the global diffusion of the product. And the reason is because even though each person who saw you wear that t-shirt is less positively influenced to go to reworking next year, a lot more people are going to see that t-shirt than the people that you choose to invite to come to reworking. So there's a volume to the global diffusion. The other really interesting thing about this is that we wanted to know, what did this do to engagement? Not just adoption of the product, but sticking with the product and not churning away from the product. And we found that personal invitations increased stickiness by about 17%, whereas the global, the passive awareness campaign did not. And the reason for that is because we care when our friends join us in an activity, we're more engaged activity, and we stay in that activity. This has a dramatic implication, which is that there is a virtuous cycle between peer adoption and user engagement and peer adoption. So if I get my friends to join me in a community, product, or something like that, then I am more likely to remain engaged with that product. As I remain engaged with that product, I'm more likely to influence more of my friends to join that product. As more of them join the product, I'm even stickily involved in that product, and there's this nice virtuous cycle. Now, there's probably some diminishing returns, it probably plateaus after a while, but this virtuous loop is really important, not just to marketers, but in all sorts of projects. For example, we are trying to use a similar randomized experiment on Facebook amongst 12 million people to identify influential and susceptible members social network. And what we do here is we take that same passive awareness campaign, which are messages sent from the application to friends, and we are randomizing who in your network gets those messages. So only a randomly selected subset of those messages are sent to friends. So each friend in expectation has the same likelihood of getting a message, which means those who who don't look the same in expectation. When that's the case, we essentially have a randomized trial of influence and susceptibility to influence in the network, and we can test things like, what does your relationship status on Facebook mean for your susceptibility to influence on Facebook? So here's what we found amongst 12 million people. People who are, so relationship status, single, in a relationship, engaged, married, and it's complicated. People who are single are more susceptible to influence than people who do not report their relationship status on Facebook. That's the holdout set. If you're in a relationship, you're even more susceptible to peer influence on Facebook. If you're engaged, you're even more susceptible to peer influence on Facebook. And if you're married, you're not susceptible to peer influence at all, apparently. If it's complicated, you're the most susceptible to influence on Facebook. So using randomized experiments, we can really find these out with causal evidence rather than correlation. We're also applying these same techniques to HIV testing in Africa. We want to have individuals take HIV tests and encourage their friends to take HIV tests and so on and so forth. We're also working on violence prevention in the south side of Chicago, in Baltimore, and in Johannesburg, using the same type of methods. So enough about outside of the organization. What about internal to the organization? What does the movement of information inside organizations mean for productivity and performance in terms of groups, individuals, teams? So the first thing to note is that, of course, and all of you know this already, of course there's an organizational structure, but most of the information that travels outside of that organizational structure. So this is a map of a company that I'm studying, just the very tippy top of the hierarchy. These are all of the, from the CEO down a couple of levels. That is the org structure in dark lines, and then the sort of cobweb that's laid on top of it that's sort of not all that visible is the email network of the firm, right? So we can observe the information flow inside a firm by observing the emails that pass between individuals. This is the same organization, and this is the calendaring network. So if you have in your Outlook calendar with someone, you get a line. This is the phone call logs of the tippy top of the network. Now, a word about social structure, okay? What do these social networks look like? Do they have some properties that are consistently true in human social networks? And yes, they do, okay? So let me start from basic building blocks, okay? So there's this notion of the forbidden triad, which is attributable to Mark Granovetter in a very famous paper called The Strength of Weak Ties in 1973. It's one of the most highly cited academic papers on the planet. It's got about 17,000 citations, which is absurd. And the basic argument is this. If A is strongly connected to B, and A is strongly connected to C, then it is highly likely that B and C a weak tie between them. Probably a strong tie. Why is this? Well, it's because B and C have a greater likelihood of bumping into each other because they're generally in the vicinity of A or walking around with A or hanging out with A. Okay? Also, homophily. They're likely to have the same preferences as each other because they have the same preferences as A. Okay? They're interested in the same topics. They're motivated by the same things. Also, cognitive dissonance. If B and C were to have a fight, it would probably hurt A's relationship with B or A's relationship with C, and B would say, if you're friends with C, I'm not going to be friends with you anymore. So that tie becomes very tight. The title or the name of this in social networks is called triadic closure. When you have two strong ties like that, the triad is likely to close. Okay, that sounds fairly academic and sort of irrelevant. People are like, where's the B? Basically, what that means is that clustering occurs in social networks, right? As the triads start to close, you get these clusters of social networks, okay? And as this clustering happens, there's connections between these clusters which are generally only weak ties. Because if this tie was a strong tie, then this would close and you would get another bigger cluster, okay? This is responsible for what is known in the general literature as the small world. So when you look at a human social network, it looks like this. A bunch of clusters connected by these weak ties. And that's called clustering or the small worlds phenomenon. Okay, so we've got a basic understanding of how human networks structure with one another with these cliques. What this clustering enables is brokerage. If you can be the person that connects these clusters to one another, you play a brokering role. You are the gatekeeper of information from one cluster to another cluster to another cluster. Okay? Well, what does this mean? Why is brokerage so important? Ties that broker between individual clusters tend to be weak ties, otherwise the triads would close. And so what does this mean? Well, this gives rise to information advantages in networks. And what do I mean? Well, if you have a network like this one, where the yellow people know yellow stuff, the blue people know blue stuff but don't know much red stuff, and the green people know green stuff but don't know much red stuff, then you have these pockets or clusters of knowledge in a network. Right? And the value of information comes from its uneven distribution across the network. The reason blue knowledge is valuable in the red space is because there's not a lot of it. Okay? But in the blue space, blue knowledge is sort of like, yeah, everybody knows that. Right? So basically, connection to diverse network neighborhoods gives you access to novel pools of information. And novel information is valuable due to its local scarcity, okay? And what this does is actors with scarce novel information can broker opportunities between people who wouldn't be otherwise connected. They can apply information to problems that are intractable given local knowledge. That is a source of innovation. It's no surprise that a lot of innovations come when disciplines rub up against each other. Because a physicist looking at a medical problem might think about it in a way that is out of the box, a way that medical scientists haven't thought about it before. And that's how new ways of thinking come about. So here's a broker in the middle, the red dot. They're connected. And they're responsible for the flow of information between these clusters in the firm. So what we know, we have 40 years of evidence that being in a brokerage position is associated with productivity, performance, and innovation. And the assumption is that the key mechanism that drives this increase in productivity and performance is access to diverse, novel information, the story that I just told you. But ever since Granovetter's first paper and lots of other people have done studies about how brokerage positions are associated with performance and productivity, nobody had ever tested whether those people actually got novel information. So we went out and did that. We collected email data in a firm over, the study was done over a 5-year period, I think, and it was an executive recruiting firm, and we specifically picked executive recruiting because information is critical to what they do. What they do is they basically perform a matching process between a client that's looking to fill a position and some candidates, right? So when they go to IBM and they say, I need a new CIO, the executive recruiter is responsible for capturing the requirements of those people, of that position, and then trying to fill it with some candidate that fills those requirements. So how do they find that out? Well, they search their network, right? They say, who do you know that's good at this and this and has this kind of educational background and would fit the personality of IBM, and then we'll try to fill this CIO position that way. So what we did was we took the email network of the firm, which I showed you the picture of here, and this is a small piece of it. And then what we did was we wanted to measure the information novelty being passed inside the emails. So we algorithmically analyzed the content of the emails. We couldn't read any of the emails. We hashed them so they were human readable. But then we ran algorithms to determine, well, how much is each person that you're talking to giving you? Is it something that you've seen before? Or is it something that somebody else is already giving you? How much is this novelty factor really making a difference? So the way we did this was with a vector space model, very simply. We represented each email as a multidimensional vector of topic frequencies, and then we represented inboxes and outboxes as collections of these email vectors, and then we just essentially measured the variance or the spread of these vectors in someone's inbox or outbox. So the greater these vectors are spread apart, the more diverse the topics that you're receiving. The closer they are together, the more similar the information you're receiving in your stream of email. Okay? And we use various measures of information similarity in the research. We validated this approach by using publicly available data so we could actually actually read. We had human readers read this information and say, yes, your measures are actually capturing information novelty rather than something else. What did we find? Well, diversity or brokerage, being in a brokerage position, having a network that connects to unconnected cliques increases your access to novelty. We also found that having higher bandwidth ties, having thicker channels to someone increases your novelty. Why? Because the first one gives you access to novelty across the channels. What A tells you is different than what B tells you. But having higher bandwidth ties gives you greater variance or topic diversity within the same channel over time. If I talk to you a lot, I'm going to talk to you about a lot of different topics. If I talk to you once every 6 months, then I'm probably only talking to you for one functional reason. You're my golf buddy or you're my tennis buddy, and we just set a time and go play tennis. Okay? The problem is that these two things trade off. The more structurally diverse your network, your bandwidth of communication channels contracts dramatically. So here is a high bandwidth network where all of these lines are very thick, and all of these people's friends are talking to one another. And here's a very structurally diverse network. None of the people that I'm talking to are talking to one another. As you can see here, they're not connected. But these dotted lines mean that I'm not really talking to them with much volume. The bandwidth of my communication channels to them is quite limited and constrained. So as you try to get more diverse, all of the bandwidth of your communication channels contracts. And so you have, on the one hand, getting novelty across channels in the structural diversity case, and getting novelty within channels in the bandwidth case, and you're in this. Where do I get novel information more from? So we did a little bit more digging, and we found out that whether brokers receive novel information depends on the information environment in which they find themselves. And 3 factors matter. Faster refresh rate is the first one. If the people that I'm talking to, if the information that they know is changing rapidly, then having greater bandwidth channel to them is more important, because every time I sample something from them, I get something new. So if I'm in an industry that moves quickly, then bandwidth matters a lot. But if I'm working in the roofing industry where the technology isn't changing but once every 20 years, then bandwidth so important. The second thing is greater information overlap. If the people in the network know mostly the same stuff, then diversity is irrelevant and bandwidth is really important. Then the last one is the topic space. If there are lots of topics to be had, each time I sample, I have the ability to get something new. If there's only a few topics being discussed, then bandwidth is less relevant and diversity is more relevant. Okay? We also found that novelty has a dramatic impact on productivity. Okay? So in essence, diverse networks create access to novel information, which increases productivity and performance, but there's a caveat, which is that it's contingent on the information environment in which the workers find themselves. Okay? So this begged another interesting question, which is, well, how does information sort of diffuse through this network? And what is the impact of information diffusion on productivity? So if this was a stock brokerage, and I was to drop a hot stock tip on this guy right in the middle, and then I was to watch that information diffuse through the network, who would receive it first? Who would receive it at all? And would this be correlated with their productivity? So we did a study using the same email data where we looked at keywords and phrases from the first time they emerged in the network as they diffused through the entire organization. And we asked, what would predict your likelihood of seeing this information and seeing it sooner? And correlated with your productivity. So here's an email, I'll blow it up for you, sent from this person on December 14th, 2002 at 12:30 to these 3 people, and then we can watch as that concept diffuses through the entire organization. Okay? And so what we did was we built models of likelihood of receiving and the time to receiving all of this information. And here's what we found. When you just consider all the information together, gender has a huge effect. In this organization, men are 55% more likely to receive information of all types, period. Controlling for the proportions to women and all the other stuff, okay? I will note that men were no more productive than women, okay? Second, demographic dissimilarity reduces the likelihood of you receiving information from someone. So gender, if you're of a different gender, you're 13% less likely to get information that they're diffusing. If you have educational differences, you have a 10% per year difference in education, less likely to receive information that's diffusing from somebody. Age differences, a 1% reduction in the likelihood of receiving information for every year in age difference. If you have a strong tie, it obviously increases the likelihood of receiving information. 10 additional emails is a 2% increase in receiving the information. Path length, how far away you are from them in the network, each additional hop means a 29% reduction in your likelihood of seeing information diffusing from that person. And if you've worked with the person before, for every project that you worked in common with them before, you have a 4% increased likelihood of receiving information that they're diffusing to the organization. We then broke this out into two types of information, news and discussion topics. So news diffuses vertically up and down the organizational hierarchy and laterally, right? But discussion topics only travel vertically but not laterally. People are always surprised by this. And the reason for this in this organization is that teams are composed vertically. So you have one person who is a partner, one person who's a consultant, and one person who's a researcher on every project. Discussion tends down rather than laterally. In terms of news diffusion, task relationships are irrelevant, right? Having strong working relationships, similar industry tenure, or similar specialization has no effect on whether news diffuses to you, okay? But in terms of discussion topics, it has a huge effect. The greater your task distance, it slows the diffusion of the information. You. Working relationships by 8%, similarity in industry tenure by 3%, and similar specializations, you get the news 80% faster if you're of the same specialization. Okay? News diffuses across strong and weak ties, where discussion only diffuses across strong ties. Okay? Men are 50% more likely to see news. Gender has no effect on your likelihood of seeing discussion topics. One additional year of education difference is an 8% reduction in your likelihood of seeing news, and one additional year of education difference is a 17% reduction in your likelihood of seeing a discussion topic. Okay. Okay, now we know how information diffuses. What impact does this have on productivity, right? What is the impact on productivity? Well, we built production function models of the access to information and productivity, and what we found was that each additional keyword or phrase seen is associated with about $70 of additional revenue generation by that person. And seeing information sooner also affects your productivity. So if you see it within the first week of its emergence in the network, it's worth about $321 to you. And if you see it within the first month, it's worth about $115 to you. So if it gets to you more slowly, it's less impactful on your productivity. We also found, very surprisingly, and much to the chagrin of some of the labor economists that we work with, that access to information was much more predictive of your productivity than all the traditional human capital combined. Education, industry tenure, experience within the organization, etc. We also studied how teams perform better or worse given the amount of information or knowledge overlap in the team. What we hypothesized was that if you have a low information overlap, there's no common ground, and you won't be able to work well as a team. Productivity or performance of that team will be low. At the same time, if you have a very high information overlap, there's no marginal contribution to having the additional team member. Everybody knows the same thing. So you need a little bit of common ground to be able to collaborate and work together, and you need a little bit of non-overlapping knowledge and skills so that each person is contributing something novel. So we expected the optimum to be somewhere in the middle. Okay? And here's what we found when we took this to the data. These are the actual data points of the mutual information overlap of the team members as measured by what they say email and what they receive in email, where this is high overlap and this is low overlap, and you can see the pattern emerging already, and these are the fitted values of the regression line. Okay? There's this clear optimum in the middle where you want some overlap but not too much overlap on a team for it to be the most successful. So what are the managerial implications of this for internal organization? Information is critical to the productivity and performance of information workers. Understanding a firm's information structure and how information moves is critical to the success of the individuals, the teams, and the organization. And organizational interventions may affect the flow of information. So how you decide to make teams or put teams together. If you decide to take somebody from this unit and put them with somebody from this unit, you might encourage a link that didn't exist before, and now you've started to alter the ebbs and flows of the information in the organization. Hiring policies. What types of people you hire into the organization is likely to information flows in the organization. Training is another big lever for a manager. And in fact, the deployment of information systems is another one, like we saw with Chemex. So essentially, optimizing the information flow is in part measurement, seeing the information flow and understanding how it's correlated with team performance and productivity, and in part action, taking actions that in ways that you think would be beneficial for the organization. So let me leave you with this thought, okay? Revolutions in science are typically preceded by revolutions in measurement, okay? So over here on the left is Anton von Leeuwenhoek, who invented the microscope, okay? And that's his microscope. I know it doesn't really look like a microscope, but that's what the first microscope looked like. So as a result of the invention of the microscope, he was able to take a drop of water and look at what's inside. He was able to take a drop of blood and look at what was inside. And from this emerged a better understanding of human physiology. And from that, Louis Pasteur, et cetera, emerged the germ theory of disease. Before, we had a very different understanding of what was making people sick, how sickness was passing from person to person. Tool like the microscope helped us understand the internal workings and how things were flowing inside the body and in between individuals. Today, we sit on the precipice of a similar revolution in our understanding of human behavior because we can see the flows of information and influence between individuals in society, on Facebook, inside organizations via email and banter and all the other types of technology. And I think that it's a really interesting time to be alive because we're going to learn a lot about how organizations and human societies function. So I'll leave it there and happy to take questions here or at the bar.